It is a time of unrest in the old world. War, treachery, and cruel circumstance have left the great civilizations of the past greatly diminished. The High Elves, having abandoned their old world colonies following the War of the Beard, have remained mostly on Ulthuan, fighting against their dark brethren. Despite their victory in that conflict, the dwarves have been beset by a series of disasters that see the stoic elder race facing death by 1,000 cuts, as their enemies gnawed at the very roots of the Karak Angkor. Nagash has been defeated, his body all but destroyed in the furnaces of his own fortress. But Nehekara, the first great human civilization, is no more. The Blessed Land is now the realm of the dead, racked by civil war as the newly risen Tomb Kings fight each other for supremacy. It is a time of change and awakening. Greetings, friends, and welcome to the story of the world that was. I'm Lorcan, and this is Only War. I'm sure some of you are developing Anakin levels of distaste for sand, considering the amount of time we've spent covering the first great civilization of man. Once we have covered the immediate events following the slaying of Nagash, we will leave the desert sands behind us and travel to the more temperate climes of the old world and beyond. With Nagash's demise, most of the newly risen dead from the great ritual collapsed back into lifeless corpses. But those sealed deep in the necropolises and pyramids of Nehekara, protected by the magical arts of the ancient mortuary cult, reawakened in a very different manner, and they would not return to their eternal rest. The mummified corpses of the monarchs, nobles, and heroes of ancient times were soon emerging from their entombment, alongside the skeletons of the warriors who served them in life, the bindings of loyalty undimmed by centuries in the grave. They emerged not into the paradise they had been promised to rule for eternity, but instead into a shattered kingdom that mirrored their own desiccated flesh and the tattered remnants of their once grand vestments. The incantations that had protected these tomb kings also allowed them to retain their memories and faculties from before they entered the realm of souls, but also within them burned the prideful ambition to rule over the lands they held in life. However, there had been hundreds of kings in the history of Nehekara. Many had ruled unopposed, believing themselves ordained by their gods to do so. Those used to supreme power do not share it lightly, even with their own ancestors, and soon king fought king at the head of legions of skeletal warriors. While battles for supremacy raged in Khemri, one tomb remained sealed, protected from Nagash's ritual magic by the most potent ancient wards. The great pyramid of Setra the Imperishable stood silent. The mightiest of all the kings of Nehekara still slumbered within its white stone walls, oblivious to the carnage raging in the ruins of his kingdom. The ancient lich priests who had served the rise and fall of Nagash despaired, as the warring kings destroyed what little was left of the once great kingdom. It fell to the oldest and wisest of the mortuary cult, the Grand Hierophant Ketep, to take the only course of action open to them. Approaching the looming white pyramid, Ketep broke the ancient seals and recited the incantation of awakening. Not long after, the greatest of all the Nehekara kings, Setra the Imperishable, was striding forth under the blazing sun at the head of thousands of warriors. Just as in life, Setra would suffer no challenges to his right to rule. At the head of his tomb guard, he smashed aside the forces of the lesser kings opposing him and ground their bones into dust, destroying them utterly. None could stand against him, and before long all the remaining tomb kings had bent the knee and Settra the Imperishable was undisputed ruler of Nehekara once more. Once restored to his rightful position, Settra summoned the Lich Priests and demanded to know why the awakening had not occurred as their teachings had promised. Now he saw his cities in ruins, his treasures looted, and swathes of his once great empire seized by invaders from foreign lands. The golden paradise he had been promised was a lie, and even worse, the very gods themselves had forsaken them. Cowering before Settra's towering rage, the Grand Hierophant told his king of the history of Nehekara since his passing into the realm of souls, 2,000 years previously. He told how Nagash became the usurper, how the covenant with the gods was broken, and concluded with the foul ritual Nagash had used to raise the ancient dead from their tombs and curse Nehekara for all eternity. Settra seethed with barely contained fury, but having learned all he could, he immediately set out to restore what he could of his kingdom. He ordered the other tomb kings back to their eternal slumber. Their tombs would be watched over by the Lich Priests. The vassal kings and their armies would only be awoken when needed. He vowed to never again allow ruin to come to Nehekara. Settra himself would not return to his long sleep. He would remain vigilant, observing the world and waging war at the head of his armies. Most of all, he watched for any sign that Nagash had returned to the world. So began what is known as the reign of millions of years, with Settra the Imperishable as undisputed ruler of the land of the dead. With Nagash's defeat, most of the members of Nehekara's vampire coven scattered across the world, concerned that the great necromancer would return and bend them once more to his will. Washuran, the former priest of Merak, escaped with a few trusted followers, and many of Nagash's great works. From these he would write the Grimnorum Necronium, and seek a cure for the vampire's bloodthirst. Neferata fled to Cathay after the fall of Lamia, but she soon attracted suspicion and was forced to run once more. She returned west, gaining the moniker the Sand Snake as she brought some of the desert tribes under her thrall and attempted to take the city of Bel Alihad. Unfortunately for the vampire queen, another of Nagash's former followers, Arkan the Black, had also set his sights on Bel Alihad. Having been driven from Nehekara by Settra and the newly awakened Tomb Kings, Arkan first travelled to Nagashazar, fighting rival immortals for what remained of their master's works. Then Arkan had turned his army south once more, and had been plaguing the deserts of Arabe in what was known as the Wars of Death. Neferata learned from Arkan of the demise of the great necromancer, before abandoning the city to its grisly fate at the hands of the Lich King. What none of the immortals was able to recover was Nagash's crown of sorcery. The ill-fated king Al-Kadazar had taken the crown once he struck down the great necromancer with the Skaven's fell blade, and had carried it with him as he staggered out into the wasteland on the verge of death. His corpse would be found on the banks of the Blind River by a shaman of the Lodringen tribe, known as Caden. The twisted metal crown contained a part of the essence of the great necromancer, and soon Nagash's indomitable will was driving Caden to construct a barrow for the fallen Kemrian king, where his soul would be bound, and around it a great walled city that he would name Murkane, and from this base of power he would start to found what would eventually become the Strigos Empire. With Nagash gone and his remaining acolytes seeking to rebuild their strength in secret, the time has come to leave the dead behind and focus once again on the living. Following the War of the Beard in 1589 before the coming of Sigmar, the newly crowned Phoenix King ARIEL ordered the High Elf armies of the Old World to return to Ulthuan to combat Malekith, the Witch King's insurgent threat. If the elven colonists desired the protection of the Phoenix King, they too would have to return to their island home. Despite being reluctant to abandon their lives in the Old World, by 1501 before Sigmar, when the last High Elf army departed for Ulthuan, only the most stubborn and hardy colonists remained. Most of these were those who had settled on the edge of the great forest known as Athel Loren. The elves living in the shadows of the great forest never considered returning to Ulthuan, their ties to their former homeland long severed. They declared themselves independent of the Phoenix throne and took the name Azrai, Wood Elves, for themselves. Despite staying mostly out of the War of the Beard, the withdrawal of the armies of Ulthuan left the dwarfs with dominion over the Old World. Determined to drive the last of the elves back across the sea, the vengeful dwarfs initially turned their attentions to the Azrai. Marching from their mountain holds as the first snows of winter fell, the WOE descended into Athel Loren with axe and flame. The spirits of the forest rose up to defend their ancient home, but the mighty treemen and capricious dryads were weakest in the winter months, and they were no match for the dwarves. Athel Loren retreated from the invaders and opened up paths that would lead them to the settlements of the Azrai. Believing the dwarfs had come to enact their vengeance for the many grudges harboured from the centuries-long conflict, the Wood Elves defended their home fiercely with bow and blade. Expertly using the forest to their advantage, the stout dwarf warriors were no match for the fleet and evasive elves. Suffering massive casualties, even the stubborn WOE had to accept this was a fight they could not win, and they pulled back from Athel Loren, cursing the elves and the ancient forest. Knowing the dwarves would not allow such an insult to their honour to go unpunished, the Azrai began to dwell deeper in the forest. They divided into groups called kin bands, each of which developed their own ideologies. The kin bands began to separate and push even deeper into the ancient forest. Now Athel Loren did not resist their passage, and seemed willing to open paths to reveal more of its secrets to the elves. Following one such trail, a kin band of magi came upon an ancient tree of immense size, its gnarled trunk and wondrous canopy standing out even amongst its colossal neighbours. They had discovered the Oak of Ages. A magi by the name of ARIEL was drawn to the mighty oak, and for the first time the very forest itself, the spirit of Athel Loren, spoke to elvish ears. Before long others were able to commune with the forest too, and they reasoned that the elves had been accepted as a beneficial force. The Azrai, for their part, embraced the forest too, and honoured its cycles, seeing their ancient gods in the changing seasons. They took only what they needed, and paid in service to their home. Only fallen trees were taken for wood, and in return they tended to the saplings that grew to replace them, even encouraging some to form graceful halls in their canopies and roots. The elves hunted the animals of the forest for hide and meat, but always honoured their bounty with a return of blood to the soil. Yet the two were not yet fully symbiotic. There were still secrets kept from the elves and parts of the forest where they could not tread. The great tree lord Durthu, his bark forever scarred by the axes of the dwarves, treated the elves with distrust, and the risk of tensions turning to hostility was never far from the surface. In 1125 before Sigmar, as autumn turned to winter, the inevitable hammerfall of dwarven vengeance came to Athel Loren. Marching down from the grey mountains into the pine crags, the WOE found little resistance from the forest spirits already entering their winter lethargy, and the kinbads of the region were scattered and few in number. Although the first forays of the dwarves were repulsed, it was clear that these were merely to test the strength of Athel Loren's defenders, and soon the full might of dwarven steel would be brought to bear. Knowing their very existence was at stake, the Aserai called all the kinbads to the first great council at the foot of the Oak of Ages, and even the trees themselves appeared to lean close, as the elves debated and attempted to divine their fate. In the glade that was now bathed in the glow of firelight, ARIEL, wisest and fairest of the elven magi, found herself drawn to the handsome ORION, lord of the greatest hunter kinbad. He was a cunning hunter of prodigious skill and unparalleled predatory instinct. While the other lords and ladies feasted and debated, the two only had eyes for each other, their conversation deep and connection instant. With sadness, the elves concluded that even with most of the kinbands assembled, the elves could not prevail over the WOE in battle. Then Adanhu, greatest and eldest of the Tree Lords, strode into the glade and spoke to the great council. The Ancient One said that although the winds of winter would soon be upon them, if the elves struck at the enemy that threatened all their existence now, before the last leaves of autumn fell, then the forest would stand alongside them. But there would be a price, a great sacrifice the Aserai must make. In their enthusiasm to set about planning the defense of their home following this unexpected alliance, the elves did not heed the Ancient One's final words, as ARIEL and ORION slipped from the glade and entered the deep woods. At first, the assembled elves reacted with anger, as it had become forbidden for an elf to choose one for another kinband as their lover. However, after long hours of searching, as the first rays of a new dawn broke through the canopy, that anger turned to concern, as no sign of the pair was found. The elves beseeched Adanhu for aid, but he remained silent to their pleas. The Magi attempted to commune with the forest and its dryads, but again they received no answer. Reluctantly, the Aserai nobles turned their attention back to the battle to come, accepting the pair were lost to them. As the last warmth of autumn was fading from the world, the wood elves marched into the mountains above Pine Crags and brought the dwarves to battle. As promised, they did not march alone. Mighty treekin strode amongst their ranks, and dryads danced and weaved on the flanks of the elven host. At the fore, mighty Durthu, bearing the scars of WOE's steel, was an avatar of vengeance, bellowing with rage as he closed the gap between the two armies with huge strides. For the dwarfs, it felt as if the whole of Athel Loren was descending on their lines. For all their stoic stubbornness, the dwarfs could not hold their ground, and their thanes were soon forced to order a retreat back to their mountain holds. They would not encroach on Athel Loren again for centuries, despite the many grudges recorded from the battle they called Karazhan. However, the respite gained from their victory would be fleeting. The winter that followed was particularly harsh, and as the spirits of earth and glade slumbered through the deep winter chill, a new threat descended from the mountains. Driven both by hunger and their natural yearning for violence, massive hordes of orcs and goblins swept down into Athel Loren, hacking and burning. Without their slumbering allies, the elves fought bravely, but the kinbads were scattered and isolated from each other, their attempts to resist the overwhelming numbers of greenskins mostly futile. The orcs built great pyres from the living wood of the sacred forest that sent massive columns of smoke billowing into the sky and filled the air with ash and soot. Midwinter came and went. The earth was as hard as iron and showed no sign of thawing. The orcs pushed deeper and deeper into the forest, the elves harrying them as best they could, but always having to give ground or risk being encircled and overwhelmed. Eventually the elves found themselves at the Oak of Ages itself, and here they would make their last stand. The elves sensed that should the mighty tree fall, the fate of Athelloren would be sealed. With heavy hearts and all hope of victory lost, the brave elves steeled themselves to give their lives in the final defense of their home. But as dawn broke, the beleaguered defenders saw the forest transformed. Against all reason, the winter snow was suddenly in retreat, and in its place the blooms burst from the thawing ground and twisting branches. Beasts of the forest awoke from their winter slumber, and the very air pulsed with the restless urgency of spring. Even the dull-witted orcs preparing for battle were unsettled by the sudden transformation occurring around them. Then through the misty forest air came the long, haunting call of a single hunting horn, accompanied by the keening call of birds of prey and the baying of hounds. A mighty figure strode through the trees, tall and muscular, with shadowy hounds pacing at his heels. The elves recognized him as Kurnos the Hunter, and all who looked upon his form were filled with a furious primal energy. Brandishing his spear and bellowing his war cry, the elven deity made flesh crashed into the teeming horde of orcs. Any that came within reach of his spear died in a whirlwind of destruction as his wild hunt swept forward to join the fray. Newly awakened dryads swarmed and capered as they struck, while midnight black raptors swooped down to pluck red eyes from sockets, leaving their blinded foes easy prey for the shadowy hounds that followed their master. The elves too charged the orc lines, their eyes aflame with their god's savage rage, and slaughtered the invading greenskins without mercy. As the last light of dusk turned the sky to a deep red that mirrored the bloodstained ground, not a single orc or goblin was left alive. The exhausted elves, the fire of Kurnos' fury finally draining from them, followed the trail of carnage left in his wake, back towards the Oak of Ages. There they found the enthroned figures of ARIEL and ORION, now transformed into aspects of Isha, mother goddess of the elven pantheon, and Kurnos the Hunter, as it had in fact been Orion, infused with the spirit of their god, who had carried his people to victory that day. The great council of Kinbads paid homage to Ariel and Orion, the queen and king of the wood. Ariel used her powers to repair the damage caused by the invading orcs, her very touch infusing life to spring forth where before there had been only ruin and desolation. Throughout the summer months that followed, Athelloren knew mostly peace. Any incursions into the forest were swiftly met and repelled by Orion's fury. Amongst the Azrai there were those that felt the spirit of the hunter deep within their souls. They joined Orion's hunts and welcomed a portion of Kurnos' power into their hearts. These Azrai would become the Wild Riders, equerries of the King of the Wood, and through their fealty and rituals the eternal spirit of the hunter was maintained. But the words of Adanhu would not ring hollow. There is always a price to be paid for the favour of the gods. As summer faded to autumn, Ariel's power remained as potent as it was on the first day of spring, but the fury of Kurnos waned within Orion as the days grew shorter. and as winter's frosty grip began to take hold, his power was all but spent. With the first snows falling on the leaves of Athelloren, the elves were ordered to build a pyre in the centre of the king's glade, and once lit, its flames rose high into the midnight sky. In a ritual that would forevermore be echoed each year, with midnight approaching and the bite of winter's chill heavy in the air, Orion approached the pyre, flanked by his wild riders. The king of the wild hunt stripped himself of his vestments and stepped naked into the flames of the pyre, his arms held aloft to the winter sky as they consumed him utterly. All night long the flames of the pyre blazed until the weak light of the winter sun broke over the grey mountains, and the inferno died down to embers, leaving no trace of Orion but ash. The wild riders silently gathered these and carried them to the council glade where ARIEL took them deep into the Oak of Ages. There she sealed herself and the ashes of her beloved away from the outside world. Every year since, as the snows of winter melt and the breath of spring brings renewal to the woodland realm, Athelloren has trembled with the waking dreams of Orion. At the call of their lord, the wild riders will come for the Azrai selected for the honour to take up the mantle of Ariel's consort king. On the vernal equinox, the one chosen to become the king of the wild hunt is garlanded with early blossoms, and his skin is adorned with mystical sigils before he is led into the Oak of Ages. The following morning, on the first day of spring, ARIEL awakens from her slumber, and the reborn Orion comes forth once more to lead the wild hunt in the protection of their realm. As the bonds between Azrai and their forest home grew ever stronger, and their fates more intertwined, ARIEL will begin to sense a malign presence in the world that was the antithesis of the avatar of Isha. This corrupted being would come to haunt the woodland realms many times in the centuries to come, but that is a tale for another time. I hope you've enjoyed our time together, and I've earned your subscription today, and I'll see you again in the near future where there is only war.